Welcome. I'm Lisa Margonelli. I'm the editor-in-chief of Issues in Science and Technology, which is a quarterly journal that is a partnership between the National Academy of Sciences and Arizona State University. Today's discussion is being hosted by Issues. And I'm really happy to introduce today's discussion. How can science fiction help design better science and technology policies? The National Academy of Sciences founded Issues 41 years ago with a mission to bring constructive contributions to public discussions and democratic decision-making that can enhance the contribution of science and technology to the creation of a better world. We love this mission, and often we've met that mission with very serious policy articles about averting catastrophes like nuclear winter, acid rain, the AIDS epidemic, and many other things. But the flip side of this mission is imagining the kind of future world that we want and designing the policies to get us there. Ed Finn, one of today's panelists, calls this exploring the adjacent possible. This fall, Issues started publishing future tense fiction, speculative fiction stories with a real policy chaser written by an expert. They are the work of Ed and the team from Arizona State University's Center for Science and the Imagination. The challenge here is, can we use science fiction to create that better world? Before we jump into the panel discussion, which is going to be amazing, I have a little bit of housekeeping. You are a very important part of this conversation. For the first half of the hour, I'll be moderating a discussion amongst the panelists. And for the second half, they'll be taking your questions. So please put your questions in the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. It's got a little question mark on it. And then please use the chat to talk amongst yourselves, being aware that this event and the chat are being recorded. We will post both on our website after the event. Just to make sure you got that. If you want to communicate with me, use the Q&A function. I can't really handle doing the chat, the Q&A, and the actual event. So let's get started. I'm going to quickly introduce all of our panelists and then jump in. Ed Finn is the founding director of the Center for Science and the Imagination at Arizona State University. Will Hurd is Chief Strategy Officer at Chaos Industries. He's also a former member of Congress, a presidential candidate, and an intelligence officer. Malka Older is Faculty Associate at Arizona State University, Executive Director of Global Voices, and she's also a science fiction author of books including Infomocracy and others. And Cole Donovan is a former Assistant Director for International Science and Technology, Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. Welcome. I'm so glad you're all here. It's great to see you. So I want to start with a question for the two policymakers on the panel. And that is, can you tell me about a time when you used science fiction to inform a policy decision or a set of choices? And I'll start with Will.
Sure, Lisa. Thanks for having me. This is a really interesting conversation, and it's an honor to be on with some of these with this panel. Look, my degree is in computer science, so I'm a classically trained engineer, and I read a lot of history books when I was a kid. I loved biographies, but when it comes to the work I did in Congress, I held the first hearings on artificial intelligence. I wrote the first national strategy on AI. It's wild to think that the first hearing on AI was in 2015. And one of the things that actually did inform my work on that is Isaac Asimov's I, Robot, right? Like it's legend. And what's crazy was that I think it was written 70 years ago, 50 years ago. The fact that the biggest issue identified in that book was talking about the corruption of training data, and the fact that they had an insight into that long ago is pretty wild for me. So I think that's one, actual concrete example. Another one, and again, I'll pass the mic. Altered carbon, right? Altered carbon and the idea is you can upload your consciousness, and the people that were super wealthy were able to do this for thousands of years, right? And if you worry about transfer of wealth over 8,000 years, or whatever the time distance was, should you worry about it over 80 years? Right. And so that was an interesting concept that forced me to think about these issues in the short term.
Oh, that's really interesting. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to ask Cole the same question, and then come back to Malka and Ed and ask them to like give us some analysis, give us a little play-by-play on what this is. So Cole, tell us your example.
Well, thank you, Lisa, and thank you, Congressman Hurd and Ed and Malka, everyone who's joining from around the world today. I'm seeing in the chat people, uh, most continents, which really excites me as an international affairs specialist. But I think that like one of the things that I found with science fiction in general and policymaking was that I worked at the State Department for a very long time. And I found myself working on subjects like high energy physics and nuclear fusion, which are incredibly difficult to explain to non-experts. And so oftentimes the vehicle by which I would use to help um, get a policymaker to understand the technology and to reflect on um, its possible consequences was oftentimes an analogy from science fiction, right? The other thing that we would see is that there was definitely science fiction that would motivate things that would happen at the United Nations. For instance, um, you would see people responding to things like gray goose scenarios with nanotechnology that would that were maybe a little bit too outlandish, that prevented us from thinking about the more real immediate impacts of the technology that we're experiencing right now. And I think that when you look at AI in particular, you can see a lot of parallels in that discussion. The other thing that I would do is I would use science fiction to understand the hopes and dreams of people from around the world. So it was really important for me not just to engage with the fiction of um, the United States, but places like China, Europe, Japan, etc., to try to get a sense of what types of hopes and dreams are motivating my counterparts in other countries. And so, that's just a few examples. Could probably go on for a while, but it's definitely a huge impact.
Those are really interesting examples. Ed, can you give us a little insight into what you're hearing about how, because you engage in kind of a formal study of how speculative fiction can be used to develop policy.
Yeah, so a few things that immediately jump to mind. First is that there are only a handful of stories that get told over and over again, and there's a sort of power law of science fiction, and that certain stories are very widely known. And I, Robot and Asimov's robot stories are definitely way up there. And if you look at in academic literature, you can find probably thousands, I think thousands of engineering papers, robotics papers that cite Asimov's three laws of robotics. And that's really interesting because you can see how those stories were driving not just at one moment of time, but generations of scientists, engineers, researchers thinking about these questions. So I find that not surprising, and Asimov was somebody who really tried to position himself as being a former of a creator of this shared imagination of the future. So I think that's really interesting. And I also like the other examples that both Will and Cole brought in of stories that present potentially dystopian futures, but Grey Goo, pretty purely dystopian. Altered Carbon, a lot more complicated. It's a future that has some amazing technologies in it, and this idea of being able to transfer to a new body, the medical technologies in that universe are really transformative. But because of the severe wealth inequality that's also present in that future, it becomes a pretty, grim world, a real cyberpunk noir world. So I guess the last thing I'll say about this is that it's not just the fictional world or the plot or the technology that's important. It's also the genre and the rules of that world. And so you can tell the same story in an Asimov universe or Richard K. Morgan Altered Carbon universe, and they will feel very different because the rules of the genre are different. And the noir genre, which predates science fiction, but the cyberpunk noir genre is it's almost like the default mode for science fiction as we think about it now. It's a very familiar way to imagine a future, the sort of Blade Runner future, dark and grim and twisty. That doesn't evoke feelings of hope and optimism, but it can be very evocative. So I think that the genre that we're playing in has a huge impact in the relationships that we build and the way that people think about these futures and the stories that they tell. And Asimov from the Golden Age starts from a default position of much more optimism about the future, and that carries through. And that's one of the reasons why I think people keep coming back to those stories.
Malka, do you have thoughts on this, on this optimism and genre issue?
Yeah, sure. And I also want to pick up on something that Cole said, which was that, well, first of all, reading science fiction from all over the world, which is, I agree, incredibly important and gives us, such a different perspective, because seeing different strands of how stories evolve can really shake up the way we look at things and the way we understand the meanings of these stories. But beyond that, you said it was to understand the hopes and dreams of people. And I think that's really important, because science fiction is a way to talk about things that in a way that includes emotion, that includes relationships, that includes individuals and how they react to things. And that's something that I think is really missing from a lot of policy, a lot of futures. If you think of the sort of classic illustration of a future world, which has these futuristic buildings and some green stuff and maybe a cool vehicle and basically no people, or all the people seen from a distance, so they're tiny, just like on a maquette. And I think so much of the ways we think about the future, whether it's through thinking about economic forecasts, or thinking about like a product launch and what's going to happen, or thinking about the next science and technology revolution, doesn't include the way people react or feel about it, or appropriate the technology and use it in ways other than what it was intended for. And all of that is so important when we're trying to understand the world, and especially what's coming next. So I really want to put that importance of using science fiction as a thought experiment that includes actual people, people who do not behave the way we want them to just because. That's what characters are for. And then, to go also to this other question of the fact that, sometimes people fixate on futures that are maybe not so realistic or not so relevant right now. If we want to take science fiction and other narratives seriously as ways of thinking about the future, we also need to find ways to be rigorous about them, because there is a huge gamut of science fiction, from stuff that is extremely rigorous and based in science and social science as well, to stuff that's really, self-insert fluff, or which is perfectly fine as a story. But when we want to think about when we want to use it as that kind of a thought experiment that does have those elements that are missing from so many of the other ways we describe the world, we want to make sure that we're looking at stuff that's well done, that's rigorous, that's thought out. So just want to put that out there for also having ways to talk about this range of science fiction, just as we talk about the methodologies of quantitative research or hard sciences.
Lisa, can I pick up on something that Malka just said? Look, my job when I was in Congress, right? I represent 29 counties, 2 time zones, 820 miles of the border between Texas and Mexico. It was roughly the size of the state of Georgia. I was always trying to communicate how things impact people, right? And so for me, I think what Malka said, like helping me understand how this technology, this issue is going to impact people in the future, that's a story that I can go back, whether I'm in West Texas with ranchers and farmers, or in San Antonio, Texas, you know, one of the biggest concentrations of cybersecurity professionals. And so I think that message is important for all those aspiring writers out there that are trying to do this. Make sure that we can connect with those people and we can see those. And I think that goes a long way with getting message in front of people that are setting policy.
I think that to pick up on this, there's some interesting threads in here. There's that there's rigor. There's that the genre maybe shows sort of a theory of change. It's that the people are in the center of it, so it's actually a way of communicating. And as Will says, it's people, you can bring people together around certain visions. Are there pitfalls of using it? Are there, Malka, have a go at it, or Cole?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I was saying, you know, I think there is this wide gamut of science fiction, and I don't think everything needs to be necessarily super hard science fiction. I think sometimes metaphor is as useful a way of talking about certain issues, for example. And, you know, and I also think it's fine to have stories that are purely to entertain, if we're clear about what that is. But we also, you know, we know that stories are incredibly powerful. And we know that it's pretty much impossible to have a story without some kind of agenda or perspective that the person who created it is coming from. And so, you know, we need to be aware that there are plenty of stories that are developed to push people in certain directions. There are stories that are perhaps not intentionally, but demonstrate, I'm sure we can all think of plenty from the Golden Age and beyond, that demonstrate various kinds of bigotry that the authors had bought into. And that gets propagated through the story as well. And that's why it's important to have a critical lens as we're using these things, and to really think about what are the both intentional and unintentional messages, and to use, I have sort of a theory about something called narrative disorder, which is that we all take in so many narratives all the time these days, constantly. I mean, when you think about it, we have access to more narratives than any of us could ever consume, right? And if we have a kind of narrative sense for when something is making sense or not making sense, but that can get skewed if all the stories that we watch or read go in a certain model, or have certain types of people behaving in certain ways. To use a sort of simple example, you know, if you watch a lot of Hollywood movies, you're going to think that soulless bureaucrats look like a certain kind of aspect. Nah, Cole, come on. you, you would not get cast in that role. I'm sorry. Central casting would not pick you. But we, you know, we all have that image, right? There's a couple of character actors who are always doing that, and that can start to warp what people expect reality to be like. So we need to be very careful about thinking what these sort of forms and repeated shapes and repeated character identifications do. And that's another reason why I think it's really important to read narratives from all over the world and back in time as well, to have that variation so that you can see when things are being repeated over and over just because some of the writers got lazy, or the producers insisted on something looking a certain way. So yeah, I think there are a lot of caveats, and I think it's really important that we are able to apply critical and rigor, as I said, you know, have methodologies for looking at what we're taking seriously and incorporating, and what we should be more cautious about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd agree with absolutely all of that, and I would just note that there's also, you know, a danger in science fiction associated with nostalgia in particular, right? Because people tend to keep coming back to similar properties, similar stories over time, and they, as people, change over time, right? Um, I think that that just the other thing that we've seen in sci-fi in particular is just that the volume of it has increased dramatically. And in many ways, that means that both the quality has gone up and down. But the availability of really good science fiction is probably better today than it's ever been before. And so um part of this is that when we look back at older pieces that might have been genre defining at their time, they might not hold up particularly well for today because they're not as thoughtful in the ways which Malka has described. And I do think modern authors have made a conscious effort in general to try to think about things or address some of the problems that we've seen in earlier works.
Will, I wanted to ask you, there is a lot of discussion of using technology along the border, and you were involved in some of that when you were in Congress. Does speculative fiction and the adjacent possible and thinking about kind of all of these sort of nice to have type things, how can that contribute to something big and real and fraught like that? Can that contribute to these discussions?
I think my experience, right? That's all I can speak to is what can we do now, right? Like I don't want to know what the thing is 5 or 10 years from now. What is the capabilities now? What can you do now to solve a current problem, right? And so look, but the speculative stuff is helpful when you're trying to wrap your head around things that are starting to grow. And I go back to AI, right? Like, so when I got out of Congress, I was on the board of OpenAI, and this was before my last run. I got off before the coup and all that stuff happened. But the thing that was fascinating is I was interviewing Sam Altman, the CEO, at a conference, and there was a lot of luminaries there that were well informed in technology, and they cursed me out after it was over, because literally cursed me out and said, "Hey, why did you talk about some of these pie in the sky stuff?" And I said, "What are you talking about? Like we're doing it right now, you know?" And so I think the what we're dealing with AI right now, not enough people understand what its capabilities are. So I think this is a case where some of the speculative stuff makes sense. I wish there were more stories that people can understand how AI is going to help, the 14-year-old girl in West Texas go to college sooner in order to change her lives. And so yes, it can have an impact when we're dealing with a new technology that we don't know which way it's going to go.
Mm-hmm. And it can kind of set expectations for what would be a good way and what would be a bad way.
Yeah, and look, there's this notion about how do you describe a utopian future, right, or whatever the middle between dystopian and utopian is, in because look, most things on social media, you got to have an edge, you got to have an elbow, so that more dystopian stuff takes a bigger more of an impact, as people are going to read about, they're going to lose their job or this major thing is going to happen. You don't talk about how my life, I'm going to get 45 minutes back or 1 hour back. Now I'm about to have a kid, my first kid. My wife's having a daughter in like less than 14 days. So the idea of having, a hour and a half more time to play with my daughter, that's exciting. Now that's not sexy and it's not going to get a ton of likes on social media, but we need to be talking about those futures.
Well, and that is actually kind of that is one of the things that science fiction is uniquely able to do, is talk about the feelings and talk about having a baby. And I just want to thank your baby as well for holding off until you could be on this discussion. So one of the things that came out of Ed's article was this idea that there's a free laboratory of the mind, that anybody can be invited into doing this speculation about the future, that speculative fiction is something that anyone can do. Ed, can you talk to us about how this can be taught? I mean, should we start to have kind of neighborhood speculative fiction groups to think about how we come together?
Well, I think there are a couple pieces of this. First, it's also just thinking about the future, which is something that we do all the time, but we don't really center or focus on that. And we teach history. I think we should also be teaching futures in school and giving young people a set of tools and normalizing that to say, here's how you can start to plan for the future and start to think about the story of what you who you want to be when you grow up. There are elements of that right now, but it's very narrow, and often it's, imagine who you are, but everything else is going to be just the same, right? So you can pick a college degree right now, and of course this college degree will be just the same 10 years from now, 20 years from now. The career that you think you're going into is going to be just like it is right now. We have all of these fallacies because we don't have a very good collective capacity to talk through and imagine these futures. We need to get better at that individually and also in social groups. So speculative fiction is a really accessible tool for doing that. And you can invite people in to explore futures, to tell their own stories. And I think the first step and the easiest step, but the most important step that gets missed is just to invite people, just to give them permission. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to go speak to college freshmen in engineering programs or lots of or professionals, experts who have been in their field for 30 years who say something like, I didn't know I was allowed to do this. I didn't know I had permission to do this. So prompting people, creating a space where they feel like they can take that risk and do something weird and imagine transformative positive change, imagine a victory condition is so powerful. That's step one. And then step two is scaffolding people, giving them some tools, saying like, here's some ways to do it, using creative constraints, because anyone, if you ask them to imagine what is life going to be like 20 years from now with a blank piece of paper, that's really intimidating. So if you give them a little structure and a little constraint and say, okay, here, how about, can you write a postcard from this future? What is this a picture of? This is an exercise we've done a lot at the Center for Science of the Imagination. Or write a headline from that future. Write a note from your future self back to the present. These little structured and grounded exercises can be really powerful. One fascinating piece of research, it shows that the farther in the future you imagine yourself, the more likely you are to imagine that future self in the third person instead of the first person. So we literally become strangers the farther out you go. So all of these tools are really powerful, and I think that you have to invite people in and make it not just an individual exercise, because even people who do speculative fiction, either reading or writing it, a lot of it is very solo, right? One person at a time. So start to think of that as a collective practice and have more conversations to normalize talking about the future in a grounded, constructive way would be really powerful.
Do other panelists want to talk about how you've integrated that into your practice? Or what other ideas you have about that? I mean, Cole, for example, I think that you said that you had kind of a reading group at one point.
Yeah, I mean, I think that it's largely it was largely to just get a sense of like, again, when we're looking at a country like China in particular, that is relatively culturally different from the United States, at least from a when viewed from a distance, I would say. It's really important, I think, to understand the hopes and dreams of folks who are in that culture, and also what they're afraid of, right? And so I think that one of the things that we did is I pulled together, or I didn't pull together, it was myself and just a couple of other people who realized, like, hey, you have this large population of people who are up and coming in the world, and how they view the future is probably going to be informative for how the way that we should approach them, particularly given that there's, an extraordinary technological competition between us, right? And so that I think was just really important to try to help understand decision making and also identify points of commonality and similarity, for between the United States and China. For instance, the the uh, the level of cultural uh, bias against authority, I guess you could say, is something that's actually very similar between the United States and China. You know, the mountains are high and the emperor is far away, right? So I think it's just really interesting that you have those reference points available to you um, when you're dealing with people from anywhere.
Something I thought that was interesting in Ed's essay was that he said, you know, reading science fiction can also give you a perspective on your own moment in history and society, and that you can read a science fiction story and then suddenly you can look out the window as though you're looking at a strange new horizon. And so it can make the present look strange. It can make you realize what you might want elsewhere. We have tons of questions, like just tons. We are not going to get through all these questions. So I'm going to read one of them. Uh, there seems to be a delta between what's actually happening in the space and what different groups of people think about AI capabilities. This has been a big barrier for us in doing public input into AI governance. It's hard to ask people what values they have and what kind of future they want from AI when that future is still so uncertain. And I'm wondering how the panelists think that sci-fi and speculative fiction could play a role in public understanding and bridging that gap to gather meaningful input into policy.
So I'll jump in quickly. This is, and with AI especially, but with many of these technologies, there is a real feedback loop. So the science fiction is directly informing the way the tools get developed. OpenAI already came up, you know, when they did one of their big releases last year. Sam Altman just tweeted Hurd, referencing the movie by Spike Jonze as part of that. So if he is thinking about that and people at the company are thinking about that, it's influencing these tools that are incredibly plastic and observing the humans that they're interacting with and adapting to them in different ways. All of this gets baked into the tools as they evolve. So the language, the metaphors, the stories and analogies we use in speculative fiction have a real influence on the way that a lot of different technologies come to being. So that's worth, you know, talking about. And I think that we need to get better at telling the near future stories. And with AI in particular, we have lots of things that we're freaked out about on the horizon, the killer robots, you know, the super intelligent God machine stories. And we keep telling those over and over again because they keep us up at night and we're worried about them, and that's understandable. But meanwhile, we don't have any stories to describe what is happening right now. You know, it's not even the future. We don't have the language to describe the present. And we need to get better at that. And I think there are stories like that. We did a project at CSI trying to address this. Malka was part of that as well. And we did an analysis of about 100 recent award-winning science fiction short stories that had AI as a theme. And even in the fiction, we don't really know what AI is. That was our conclusion. You know, when the author controls everything and calls all the shots, it's ambiguous, it's unclear who's in charge, how you know, how much agency does the system have? It's really hard to tell. So we need to write more stories that get into the visceral, immersive experience of what these technologies could be like, because actually deciding what they could, imagining what they could be like, and maybe what they should be like, will have a real impact on how they turn out.
Yeah, I mean, I'm basically in that world right now. So I'm currently working in the Office of Space Commerce. I'm not speaking on their behalf today. But you know, usually one of the core functions of our office is tracking space debris. And you know, if people ask, well, why is that important? The thing that people immediately come to is the movie Gravity, right? And that is not just a near-term science fiction, that's science fiction that it envisages two space stations that are in orbit today, and a very real problem that exists today that could become catastrophic if things go wrong up there. Physics in the movie are atrocious, but what like the danger is actually real. Um, and like I think that having that experience in a lot of ways helps the operators and the folks who are working on the track system at Commerce really understand and get to grips with the reality of what they're dealing with in a way that forces them to action, and it really helps. I would say the government understand the necessity of doing some of these things because of the very real dangers that are associated with the amount of stuff that's currently in orbit.
Another question is, uh, we are so used to seeing dystopias, and some segments of society are living that right now, or have been living through them in the past. How do we send a greater diversity? How do we seed a greater diversity of utopias to better inform policy and civic dialogue? I mean, one thing that was going through my mind, as I think Ed was talking, and also Malka, was like, maybe you need a license to write science fiction. Like, if you're going to influence, the big AI developers, or like Asimov is what now influencing his fourth generation of engineers, there's a lot of power in that. But there is this there is this break between the dystopian and the more utopian or protopian. What do you?
Yeah, if I can say, first of all, I don't think there is a ton of power in it, but I don't think anyone should need a license to write science fiction. I'm going to go with Ed and say, if you need permission, I'm giving you permission right now. And one of the things that I had to learn when I started writing science fiction was to give myself permission to make stuff up, because it can be quite hard to do that. Like, I really had a moment where I was like, I don't know what the future is going to be like in 7 years, and something could happen tomorrow that will totally change it. And in fact, I'm a little angry at a certain country that changed the name of their capital after I published a book that included that name. Anyway, these things happen. It's you got to give yourself permission to make things up, because the important thing is not the details, it's the story that you're telling, which is often more about today, as Ed also said. But I am that is a bit of a tangent. People should not have to have a license. In fact, I think the thing that we need to be aware of is the way that the way that those certain stories that get very popular, as Ed said, it's the mechanisms that make certain stories very popular and very accessible to everyone that we need to be paying attention to, in terms of which stories are the ones that get published, get hyped, get a movie deal, get a lot of a big publicity budget, get people talking about them, get reviews. I think that's something to be aware of in terms of what's driving certain stories about certain things in certain voices and with certain characters. But to go back to the question about dystopia and utopia, I mean, I personally think that utopias are very, very hard to write, because if everything's fine, it's very boring. And I also think it's an unrealistic goal, because there is no perfect system. There is no status quo that's just going to stay the same and be great all the time. We need to think about how people and systems work and continue to meet different challenges and continue to work towards improving things, without the idea of there's going to be like the magic toss the ring in the volcano, everything's fine. And notably, that's not what happens. They have to go back and they still have to rebuild a bunch of stuff and kick out some bad guys. And so, for me, it's much more interesting to think about. I personally like to think about and write sort of more or less optimistic, but far from perfect situations. I think there's a big role for what's called dystopias, because I know a lot of people who get a catharsis from reading them. I think warning is important, just as hopeful imagination is important. I do think that we have, I think that what we call dystopias, as you very rightly said, Lisa, many of them are things that are being lived right now by a lot of people. They're not the equivalent of utopia, because the things that we call dystopias there's still hope, there's still good things going on. And I think by calling them dystopias, it's actually a distancing mechanism for us to say, oh no, that's not happening. And to avoid seeing that it is in fact happening to a lot of people in our societies and around our world. So I think, yes, there should be more stuff in the middle, and there should be more but as in the middle, but all across the middle, okay, except for those extremes, because I do think that variety, different people's brains work in different ways, and different people need different ways of thinking about what the future can be like, whether it's a warning or hopeful or muddled all through.
Will, did you have something?
I do. Look, I love that notion that, like, when we describe these things as dystopian, we think that it's not reality. Look, when I was looking at legislation and when I was trying to do things in Congress, I was always trying to, okay, what are we trying to achieve? Like, what's the thing that we're trying to do? And then how are we trying to minimize the impact? Like who's the group of people that we're trying to lift up? And so I think you need all of those stories. You need to understand the people that are being screwed by the government or by that thing, and figure out how do you make that situation better for them. But you also got to skate to some future vision of where you want to be. And so I do believe all these kind of stories are important. The one thing I would also add, if we're talking about legislators, right, we also need some of these stories in short form. Okay, that's something that's super important too, so that you can understand and grab it, and then talk to your constituents about it, and have it impact your work in whether it's local government, state government, federal government.
That brings up another question that somebody else asked, saying it's probably the most effective form of science communication with the public, yet it seems that very few, if any, science institutions and research agencies include sci-fi experiences, stories, games, or videos in their science communication strategy. Why is this? I don't know if anyone else here can answer that, but I thought I'd throw it out there.
I'm slightly insulted because I made a point of doing that. When we were at state, I would say, maybe we didn't do it enough, I think, but, seriously, I think that oftentimes it's really important to leap on the moment, that you're working with at a particular time. So, when I was at OSTP, the movie Dune came out. It just so happened that we were working on something called the Deep Underground Neutrino Experiment, which is a big facility that's out in South Dakota in a giant gold mine. And so what we tried to do was we did some social media around the Dune release, and we used that to explain neutrinos using as many puns and bad jokes from the book as possible. That if you were someone who read Dune, you would get all of it, hopefully. And I think that there's a real importance to try to make sure that as policymakers, you are linking yourselves to the moments in culture that people are experiencing in their own lives. Because to somebody in the middle of the country, they are never going to know that there's this, sinkhole in South Dakota that has, a city block sized, jug of liquid argon, basically, that trying to tell us how the universe began. But if you can take something that they are experiencing right now, which might be a movie, then you can draw that link between them, between those things, right? So, yeah. In the chat, I just saw the Chernobyl series come up. That was definitely an opportunity for folks to talk about nuclear safety again, and just explain. I think it was really important for the nuclear energy community to basically be like, yes, we have taken all of these things into account, and then also to describe the science as it actually is, as opposed to the way that it was presented in the show. And I do think that the nuclear community stood up to the moment in that particular instance.
Yeah,
That's
and Lisa,
course, yeah.
I also think, look, when I first ran in 2009, I definitely would not have been referencing sci-fi or talking about even technologies that were in the future. But because I think people realize how fast technology is moving, and the technological evolution we're going to see in the next 44 years is going to make the last 44 years look like we're a bunch of animals playing in the dirt with sticks. And I never would have thought about mentioning the word fusion in a speech somewhere. I would never have talked about synthetic biology, right? Like, quantum computing, people would be like, get out of here. And so like I think because there's this realization and becoming a realization that these technologies are moving so fast, I think that's a little bit of license to have more conversations and refer back to things that has pushed the boundaries on this.
I do want to just quickly say, and while I think that uh, the tendency to react to big commercial science fiction is a good idea, and it's a way to get people, find the audience where they are, right, and engage with them around a big movie or something like that. And I've done that as well, and it's a way to open up a broader conversation. But I do think it would be really great to see more agencies and government groups actually telling stories about what the future looks like. If this policy is really successful, this is what it's going to look like. Because that would be an amazing way to have a real conversation about is that the future we actually want? And oh, you're telling me this story about how this future is going to look. Do I believe your story? Maybe this piece of it is not quite as plausible. Can we talk about something else? And I do think uh, there's anxiety and there's a certain amount of fear, right, about doing something weird like writing science fiction that is not in the normal wheelhouse of, say, a policy expert. There's also maybe sometimes a hint of like, well, we don't actually want to have to talk to everybody about this, that like, can we just stay in our, like, hang out with these experts that we hang out with? I'm a specialist and I want to work with my other specialists and the people I see at the conferences and gatherings. And it's going to be too messy and scary if I have to actually have this discussion in a broader public way. I don't think that's the primary motivation, but I think that's occasionally part of the mix.
Once you start introducing the element of fiction, like you've kind of lost all controls.
Yeah.
You can you and your facts are no longer in charge. Just to build on what you were saying about science fiction stories that may not be big ones, but that can create a lot of discussion about the policy options. I mean, obviously, Kim Stanley Robinson's Ministry of the Future is, or Ministry for the Future, is one where, you have these sort of empowered bureaucrats, but they're empowered essentially by violent groups that give them the option of leading. And well, I don't know. I mean, it did seem like it brought up policy discussions. I'm not sure that they were helpful policy discussions, but I don't know. I could go back to audience questions rather than raising that one.
Well, look, Lisa, while you're looking at the next question, here's like, articulating a vision for a future is like not necessarily sci-fi, right? Like, look, everybody on this, if you're on a call at 4 o'clock in the afternoon or the morning or the night, wherever you are in the world, you care about how science fiction impacts policy. But the goal is to, the goal of any person at any level of politics is to explain this future state, why it matters, and what you're doing in order to get there, right? And so, and we go back to Malka's point. This is why she's won awards, right? This is talk about the character, right? What is the setting you're trying to do, and talk about the character, and you give those to people. And I think you can, like that. I wish I had more of that when I was in office. I wish I had people articulating things in that way that I can digest in a short format, because that's what you do. You create that vision for the future. And we can call it sci-fi or we can call it something else, but a lot of people are doing it.
Yeah, I would agree with that entirely. In OSTP, you're basically trying to describe a vision of the future by, talking about what science we should invest in and what technologies we want to build. It's probably true that we don't externalize that well enough. And I would say that's probably, because a lot of science has a real fear of explaining something that could be, that's not necessarily rooted in facts that we know, because it diminishes the credibility of what we're trying to do to some degree. But I'd say that depends on the field, particularly in aerospace. People have no problem at all linking the things that they want to do with, missions to Mars, missions to Pluto, do whatever, right? Look for life on IO, all kinds of fun stuff, right?
So one question, and then we'll sort of go to the final round, but a very quick question is, could you speak on the temporal distance between these really compelling concepts and technologies in sci-fi and the technology in the world that we're grappling with currently? Is there a trend towards near future sci-fi as tech catches up to the imagination, and how do we continue to use it to think about and explore the far future? Is there any tension between near future and far future?
I mean, I'd say that the biggest tension between near future and far future is that the far future has a tendency to become near future very quickly. And oftentimes that's because of sci-fi. I mean, a lot of what we see in mobile devices today was inspired in large part because of properties like Star Trek and things like that. This is all stuff like, obviously there's a lot we don't have replicants, in the United States, or anywhere where today, and I'd say that there are a lot of technologies that, just as a philosopher, I would say I would even question whether they can actually do the things that they promise to do. But um I think oftentimes just the existence of the idea tends to move things along in ways that are unexpected.
Okay, here's sort of the last question. So Star Trek, as Ed has described it, it's a protopia. It's a vision of a future that might not be perfect, but it's pretty good. And I think the question for now is, in both policy and as citizens of the world, um, what are the elements of the kind of protopia that we need for thinking about the future with excitement, joy, something to look forward to, and not fear? And how do we help us out? Give us some seeds. What would be the rules for that protopia? What are some things you'd like to see in it?
Look, I think one of the things that you want to see in this protopia is, how does at least of our brothers and sisters survive in it? Like, how does this actually uplift humanity in a way across all continents? And yeah, maybe that may be what's the word, naive to think that's going to happen, but we need to be able to talk about those states to give people a goal to hit.
Yeah, I completely agree. And, you know, when we were talking about dystopias, I mean, I think the Hunger Games is often spoken of as a dystopia, right? And it gets pretty close. But the people who are living in the capital, they don't think they're living in a dystopia. And I think that's really important to remember, that, when we're looking at these books, and I think, I do think that a lot of writers are very conscious of this. And if you read something like William Gibson, for example, is excellent at really going through and showing people living in a lot of different ways throughout the societies that he envisions. I think in terms of making the future something that's exciting for people, there's a couple of different ways you can do it. I mean, if you have a fun plot with cool characters, it's going to feel exciting, even if there are miserable people on the edges and it's actually a terrible place. But there was actually an interesting thread going on Blue Sky by the author G. Willow Wilson, who was talking about the question of the kinds of good guys and the kinds of bad guys that get written now, and how that contributes to the way people see real life actors in the world, celebrities of various kinds. And so one thing that I think is really important to create futures that are great for all of us is to think about the kinds of people we're writing about, and the kinds of, that is not just, you know, one hero who's amazing at everything, but actually relationships between people, systems, organizations. For me, this has always been a fascinating thing. I'm kind of an organizational nerd, so like I get it's not for everyone, but there are lots of different ways to show that it's not just, you know, the one chosen one character who can do no wrong and solves everything. There are lots of ways to bring in other characters to, or to demonstrate that there's assistance, or to demonstrate that different people have different needs. And finally, you know, I think to make a future exciting for people and welcoming for people, it does come down to the people and the characters. I mean, I will read a book and enjoy it if it has amazing ideas, but I'm not going to reread it unless I like spending time with the characters. And I think that's says something really important about people and what we need in our futures, which is the ability for people to have relationships of all kinds and to live their lives and interact. And that is at least as important as whatever kind of flashy tech is making it also look kind of shiny on the outside.
Ed?
Yeah, building, I agree with everything that Will and Malka said. You know, this is maybe sounds tautological, but in this future, people have to believe in the future. They have to have a common sense of purpose. I'm a story guy. I think people need to believe in a shared story about what this society is all about. And that should be a story about improving the lot of everybody in that society. That story becomes a yardstick for positive progress, right? To try to understand whether the society is moving towards this shared goal or not. And I think that, you know, what we're really talking about is civics, right? We're talking about participating in a shared narrative and believing in it, and not in a monolithic way, right? Not in a sort of authoritarian, everyone must believe exactly the same thing way. In fact, I think that narrative is stronger when you also have individuality and complexity and many different characters and you know, diverse sort of foundations that all come together to say like, oh, we all believe in this. And so I think that's what makes for a protopian future.
Beautiful.
Yeah, I would add, you know, to all of this trust in human thought and decision making, right? Because a lot of this comes down to um trusting that people will make the right decisions when they're confronted with really hard problems. And it's even better, as Malka said, if it's not the main character who does it, when the story zooms away from them and you see, you know, ordinary people who you just met 30 seconds ago doing things for the right reasons and then getting the problem right in incredibly difficult circumstances. Um, that is, I mean, that's the heart of stories like The Martian, right? Where people come together to save one random person who happens to be on Mars at that particular point in time. And I think that's something that we hope as a species that we'll do when the time comes.
And for those of us on Earth as well, I think that seems like a good note to end on. I really want to thank you. This has been just an incredible conversation. Thank you so much, Ed, Will, Cole, and Malka. Thank you. To read more future tense fiction, as well as expert commentaries, visit issues.org, and to get news of events, news stories, commentary, interviews, podcasts delivered to your inbox every Friday, sign up for our newsletter. We'd also love to hear your thoughts on today's conversation and how we might continue it in some virtual realm. We don't know what it is yet, but we're looking for your suggestions. So please write to us at editors@issues.org, or find some name on the website and send us an email. Thank you for joining us. Thank you to the panelists here, and a special thank you to the Future Tense team, which is Ed Finn, Andres Martinez, Joey Esrick, and Mia Armstrong Lopez. See you next time. Your day.